seems like right now is very much the key time. If you're going to arm Ukraine, you need to do it now. So could you talk a little bit about, because you were begging them for arms, for your revolutionary army, so now is the time to do it. So could you kind of talk about that how important the window is?
Absolutely. I mean, the window's open with conflicts like what's going on in Ukraine and in Syria. Everything sort of comes in stages. So if you don't sort of exploit that stage and act now, things become infinitely more complicated in general. And I would dread to see Russia sort of following in the footsteps of Syria. And as Michael said, and others, that the numbers of the dead is going to only increase. We have, in terms of the revolutionaries in Syria, they are fighting against the Assad regime, totally supported with, missile systems from Russia, the advanced weapons. We're getting bombed by Russian MiGs every single day. They drop these barrel bombs that are essentially big drums of chlorine gas sometimes, but mostly gasoline and shrapnel that falls down absolutely no targeting whatsoever. It's a 500-meter circumference, and children have been some of the most affected by these things, other than 200,000 people that have died, which is a very minimal sort of amount. But anyway, in terms of arming them, if the Syrian rebels were armed, and we still need arms now, because they're also fighting another front against ISIS, and it's funny, the president, as Michael said, really cares about a deal with the Iranians, so he's afraid any extra pressure on Assad or something would rock the boat on that. And what it's resulted in is the expansion of ISIS that's only fighting against the rebels because they have a mutual interest with the Assad regime, knowing that the only people that can defeat them are the Syrian people. If Assad regime, and it rarely does, but if it does fight against ISIS, it's a recruitment tool for them. But if the Syrian people fight against them, for every one that a Syrian rebel kills from ISIS, they 50 or 100 defect. So the importance of arming both the Ukrainian army and the Syrian opposition is incredibly important, especially at this moment, because the longer it takes, the harder it's going to be. And the United States will ultimately be dragged slowly into something that is much, much more complicated and much worse. He was mentioning the soldier about how they only get food and stuff. There's no arms or barely even food. When I took Senator McCain inside of Syria and met some of the rebel fighters, Senator McCain is great on both issues, and he was saying, I'm sorry, I'm going to try to pressure my government to help you, but how is the aid that we've sent you already? And one of the young men fighting said, we don't need pizza, we're fine on food, we need something to fight. And so it is incredibly important if we're not willing to sort of support with aerial support, or by the way, logistical and intelligence support is also incredibly important, and that's not happening. There needs to be support for the defense against both the Assad regime and ISIS, and for the defense against the Russians in Ukraine. So that's pivotal, incredibly important.
So Damian, as you mentioned earlier, as a recovering Obama supporter, I think quite a few Ukrainians find themselves in that category. And it's not surprising, of course, that you didn't vote for him a second time because you already saw the behind the scenes of his administration's foreign policy. So it sort of seems like Obama's trying desperately just to not be George W. Bush. It's like you almost kind of wonder, like, who's the parrot on his shoulder just feeding him his philosophy that he's just clinging on to. And it sort of seems like, liberals, and I say this as like a hippie-dippy Northern California liberals, really demonize George W. Bush. He's just the devil, he's the worst thing ever. Bush shares with a dark cloud. So it feels like he sort of like must not be Bush in his head. Like, do you kind of get a sense of that?
Well, he came in as a president to get us out of the Iraq War, and the Iraq War was a huge blunder. And, there's no reason American force shouldn't be there. And America, I think, has fatigue with foreign conflicts because of that, because America did suffer significant losses and cost. And I think there's now a hesitancy to get involved in other foreign conflicts because of that, because of this fatigue. But certainly Obama came in as a president whose platform was to get us out of Iraq and get American force, bring troops home. So I think that is a big psychological thing for him, where he came in that platform, and it's hard for him to change gears and engage in a new conflict. I think he's scared of Putin escalation with Russia, for sure.
I had a surreal moment. Samantha Power during the Obama election in '08 called Hillary a monster because she voted to allow Bush to invade Iraq. And then just last November, I saw Samantha Power speaking, and she got ambushed by anti-war Code Pink activists. And I thought, this is, look at this. So in terms of like getting through though to him, it seems like he's very happy to be drinking that culture of consensus, European style that he's sort of kind of fallen victim to, and like, oh well, I can't do it unless Germany agrees.
Look, first of all, there's no advisor that's getting, the parent is his brain, it's him deciding all of this stuff. And he did come in saying, I'm going to come out of wars in the Middle East, so I don't want to get involved in the one foreign policy thing. Everything else was domestic policy that he had on his agenda, was to get rid of more weapons of mass destruction in the world, and that's the Iranian deal that he's working on. And even that has been a huge, at least as far as I'm concerned, failure. But, I think the only way to get to him would be to shame him, because Ukraine and Syria, in Iraq is more complex, so it's harder to sort of put in. But let's give him an okay on Iraq. Let's say in Ukraine and Syria, those should be his Rwanda. And that's what he cares about, his legacy more than anything else. In one event, we had a chance to talk to him very briefly, and it was said, Syria will define your legacy. And he said, well, my legacy will be defined by many more things. But that really got to him. And I think that's where he even with his own base. Look, I'm in New York because I was at the United Nations putting together a display of photos. A Syrian military policeman who early on in the revolution, 2011 in Syria, 9 months of non-violent peaceful protests, no one put up a gun, as bare chests were met with bullets and unlawful arrests and so on. And this photographer who works for the Assad regime, on the first days of the revolution, started being asked to go and take forensic photos of men, women, and children that were tortured to death. Some of them were his own neighbors, and he recognized them. He couldn't even go back and tell his neighbors about it. They resulted, over 2.5 years, it resulted in getting almost 55,000 pictures of over 20,000 people that were tortured to death. We put this up just very recently. It'll be up in the UN for 2 weeks. If anybody has a chance, they should go see it. It's unbelievable. It reminds you of every never-again moment that's been sort of mentioned in the past. But I think another problem, another thing that you get to him is in the past, even when it came to Bosnia and so on before, people in the administration, it was the Clinton administration, the Democratic one too at that time, people resigned, people left, people protested. But it seems that even those frustrated with the policy within the administration fear doing anything that may sort of, kick them out of the sort of the fold that they're under. So I think shaming the president through the media, through bringing up these facts, there are, as Michael said, lying, and we should call them out for it. I think that's the best method we have, and hopefully, the conscience of the nation of the United States will help push that. And his caring for his own legacy would be something that makes him reconsider a little bit. But everything he does and says in terms of this administration, even in terms of health, are sort of reactionary things that are just based on political calculations. So he'll say he'll arm the rebels in Syria, and that hasn't even started yet. The announcement came almost a year ago. And Assad regime comes out and says to a Western media outlet, I'm going to kill everyone that is trained and sent in. And then he says, well, we can't protect them against the Assad regime. They must only fight ISIS. They can't use our weapons against them or the training that we give them. It's unbelievable.
Is he afraid that he's going to get sued? Is he just like...
Yes, that's exactly it. Everything has to be lawyered. I mean, every time the U.S. conducts an airstrike in Iraq, they have to go through the lawyers. As if only Qasem Soleimani had red tape in Tehran, he had to go through every time he wanted to.
But the lawyers speak what they wanted to say. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the one thing. The lawyers are.
It's amazing to me. I mean, Martin Dempsey was a very good soldier. He's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was the head of the commander of the 1st Armored Division in Baghdad. Not an easy portfolio to have. For him to come out and say, well, maybe Iran can play a positive role if it doesn't resort to sectarianism. If Iran doesn't resort to sectarianism, before coming here today, there's a new anthem that says Soleimani, the falcon of the Shia. And I'm like, if Mark Dempsey were right, it would say Soleimani, the falcon of all the Iraqi people, and especially the minorities. Unfortunately, that's not the way it goes. And this is because politics, the military, everything has become so politicized, and everyone has to do the bidding of the commander-in-chief. The other thing that really gets me down on this is there's always, well, if you don't back a deal with Iran, on whatever terms we have secretly decided, which we'll brief you on later, you mean you're a warmonger. You want to go to war. Who says who? Says who? Intervening to help the Syrian people, by the way, not even regime change, but just regime isolation in Syria, giving a no-fly zone. We're flying aircraft in every day. Not a single one has been shot down by Assad. A, because he probably couldn't. B, because he knows that if he did, that would be it. He would be gone tomorrow. We can't provide a no-fly zone for the people in Idlib and Aleppo who are having barrel bombs dropped on their heads because it's a legal bureaucratic dispute. I mean, again, people's lives at stake, and the people we're listening to on Meet the Press, A, have never been outside of the United States, except maybe the London on the Road Scholarship, and B, haven't gone and visited these refugees, they haven't talked to anybody living in these countries because they don't care. They want to protect the president from conscience, essentially. I'm convinced. I'm absolutely convinced. And this idea that there is no such thing as a military solution, these things don't get resolved through violence or the use of force. If only Mr. Putin and Mr. Soleimani and Mr. Assad believed the same thing. If only the world would work that way. During the Cold War, there was this intellectual trap that Sovietologists came up with. It was called mirror imaging. Well, the rational thing to do in the following set of circumstances is X. Therefore, the Soviets will do X. You mean like invade Afghanistan? You mean like, perpetrate assassinations or other? You have to, ideology matters, and frankly, the nature of these governments, the nature of what they get up to, matter incredibly. How did ISIS manage to take over 1/3 of Syria? As Mouaz said, when has Assad ever fought ISIS? In the beginning, I talked to defected Syrian diplomats, I talked to defected military soldiers. The regime was giving arms to jihadis. They were letting them out of prison, knowing these guys would run roughshod over the country, start cutting people's heads off, and then Assad goes to the West with a choice. It's either me or the terrorists. There was the chant that the pro-regime militias and the Syrian army used to chant when they were just still shooting at 13-year-old boys and torturing people in prison was, Assad or we burn the country. That's your choice. Assad or we burn our own fucking country. What kind of a man like this can you negotiate with? What is the political solution there? For him, leaving power, ending this dynastic dictatorship that's been 40 plus years, is a matter of life and death. He will not go out of Syria except feet first. And I think we should help him.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, it's in this regime, for example, too, the United States, we've had meetings sometimes with policy people at the DOD and the Pentagon, when we go down to Tampa and meet with people in Special Operations Command and others. I can tell you, even everyone in the Department of Defense, at least people that are actually doing the work, are incredibly frustrated. They're kept on a short leash. They're not allowed. You talk to them about Ukraine or Syria or otherwise, they would be clapping along with everyone else to what's being said. So it's important to keep that in mind. But whenever they do give the argument that if we do this, then Russia might escalate or Iran might escalate or otherwise, these are excuses in the United States. When it does, the only thing that he's done is he said at one point, he gave the credible threat of the use of force against the Assad regime right after the chemical weapons attack. The Assad regime, since its inception, had denied even having chemical weapons. Just because we moved a couple of ships in the Mediterranean, he not only admitted that he had chemical weapons, he also got rid of some of them. He kept others and is using some of them right now against us. But that's all it takes. It doesn't have to be a military solution, but there needs to be an enforcement mechanism, and there needs to be the understanding that the United States is really sitting at the table and leading the nations against these despotic dictators that are coming in and trying to take over countries and empowering terrorists because they want them to be the other option. But as depressing as all of it is, the Russian soldier said he's ready to go back to fight. I mean, after such huge injuries, he's already paid his debt, but he's ready to do that. And so is every other freedom fighter across the board in Syria and other places that are working. They're amazing. They're operating schools and their civil councils and civil police police forces and defense forces against both Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Assad regime and Hezbollah and the IRGC and the Russian advisors that are there and their weapons. And as long as these guys are going, as depressing as it is for us here, there's no excuse for us to say, oh, we gotta put our hands up and give up on it, because they haven't. And who are we to say that sitting in the United States? But to add to that, this is the only country that can make a difference. This is the only country that can put an end to everything. And so it's an obligation on all of us to keep working here until we get the president to change, or we can pressure him through different areas, whether it is media or the U.S. Congress.
Thank you very much. And so in terms of that slight crack in the door that we saw with Biden's phone call to Poroshenko today, saying, hey, we're going to send you some drones, we're going to send you some armored vehicles, is that sort of a light that more will follow? No. Of the audience?
There's a big problem too, which is every so often the CIA calls journalists in to brief them on some issue, so basically planting, U.S. spin on intelligence. And I know one journalist who was called in not too long ago, and I said, what did they say? They said, well, their line is, after Putin, something much, much worse will come.
Yes.
So, I take that to be that the U.S. intelligence is objectively pro-Putin. I was in the State Department in November, and I talked to one of the guys who claimed to be in charge of the sanctions regime. And I said, sanctions don't do anything to dissuade Russian foreign policy, as we've seen. But the nice thing for people like me, journalists who want to expose the enormous Russian corruption, 1/3 of the GDP in Russia is frittered away through bribes. That's tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And I said, the nice thing about sanctions is it's information warfare. If you sanction Gennady Timchenko and Gunvor, and then you say Putin has access to cash and has assets in Gunvor, I can write whatever I want about these guys. And whereas 6 months ago they would have sent me a libel letter and threatened to take my house away. I don't have a house, but whatever. Today it's like a very politely worded corporate public relations guy saying, oh, it's all a misunderstanding, we're happy to talk to you on the phone. We've got lawyers working with the Treasury Department. I said, so Putin's assets in Europe, all of the oligarchs in the Siloviki and what they've invested in, the Rotenberg brothers with their villas in Italy and so on and so forth. I said, why don't you just keep ratcheting up the sanctions against them by disclosing the nexus of dirty cash between Moscow and Berlin, Moscow and London, Moscow and Paris, and so on. And I swear to God, this guy said to me, he says, well, if we do that, we're worried about what Putin will do next. I said, what, like invade Ukraine? I mean, this is a joke. You're sitting on essentially what is this man's Achilles heel. What does a mafia state care about? Money. And he's not putting his money in Russia. He's putting it everywhere but. And this is why the European Union, I'm sorry to say, is so supine and so pathetic and can't get their act together. This is what the Italians and the Spanish are lining up to say, a return to the status quo ante. Just make a deal, cut a deal, give him the Donbass, let him keep Crimea. Hell, if he wants Mariupol, just hand him that too. We want to do business. We want we want the energy supply to run again. We want all our dodgy, businessmen who probably have political portfolios or to wind up on the board of Gazprom and Rosneft and all the rest of it. Just one last anecdote, because I am a journalist, so I collect these little bits. When I was in London last, I met a very charming and very brilliant German reporter who works for Die Welt, which is like the mainstream center-right newspaper there. And I couldn't believe this. He has one beat as a reporter, and his beat is to expose former Stasi spies on the Russian payroll. So imagine a country where, if you follow the local police beat or the crime beat, or you follow like city politics. Imagine having like the New York Post, where it's outing former, Russian intelligence operatives or German intelligence operatives, which are on the payroll of a foreign government. That's Germany for you, and that's why Frau Merkel, even though she's talking the tough talk and disinvited Putin from the World War II memorial, when push comes to shove, says, no, Mr. Obama, don't send the Ukrainian people any weapons. We need to sort this diplomatically. But you're quite right, Mouaz. This is what I call the Ghostbusters principle of world affairs. When shit hits the fan, who are you going to call? It's the United States. Everybody does it. All of our enemies pick up the phone, they call us first. Assad, what's his whole policy? His whole one foreign policy objective. Please, please, please talk to me. Please, 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 legitimate me. Please, I'll create terrorism and then I'll offer to solve it. So I'm your ally in the war on terror. Please, please, please. That has governed everything. It governed it when Assad was sending jihadis, including Al-Qaeda in Iraq, into Iraq to blow up American soldiers. It governed it when it created or abetted and facilitated the rise of ISIS in eastern Syria, and it persists to this very day. With Putin, it's very simple. It's also similar. Is it any coincidence that the Nemtsov murder, the first suspects they go after are Chechen jihadis, and why did they kill the former deputy prime minister of Russia? Because he wrote on a blog that 8 people in the world read that he supported the journalists of Charlie Hebdo. Show me one Russian that didn't support the journalists of Charlie Hebdo, except Ramzan Kadyrov. Yeah? This whole thing stinks, but what is the purpose? How did Putin come to power? I'm going to wipe him out of the outhouse. I'm going to salt the earth in Grozny. I am the master counter-terrorist. Who was the first person to call George Bush after 9/11? Putin. My friend Kyle Parker, who everyone here should know because he authored the Magnitsky Act, which is one of the most landmark pieces of human rights legislation. He has a great line. He said, Putin's MO is create a problem, then pretend to solve it, and then take a bow. And all of the dictators we're dealing with in the world today, they were trained by the KGB and the Soviets, and they learned the same exact lesson, and they're doing the same exact thing. And we have learned nothing. Not a goddamn thing. So, again, another depressing note. I'm sorry.
I mean, just to add, it was talking about, with the pictures, by the way, the 55,000 pictures of men, women, and children tortured to death, each one of them. It's incredible. By the way, it included in those people are people from, with European nationalities. We highly suspect there may also be American citizens, and in the analysis that's now within the State Department's hands, we still haven't gotten any of that back, or the identity of the Europeans, which is a very inconvenient truth because we mobilized an international coalition because 2 American journalists who were very brave, who went to Syria to cover the plight of the Syrian people, were killed. But 200,000 people in that international coalition, but 200,000 people did not move the United States to do anything about it. All of those pictures, it was Russian advisors and based on very high-level international humanitarian experts and others and forensic analysts. It was Russian advisors that trained on the processing of these dead, because they took a picture of each killed person, put a number from which branch they tortured them at, and their death number, and they moved on. It's something incredible. So it shows how closely they are working together. At the end of the day, the argument that the Russians, the Iranians, the Syrians, etc., the regime, are all in, and they're doing everything they can now. So if you are ever in meetings and they tell you, well, we're afraid of the reaction, like Michael said, what, invade Ukraine? No, they're already all in, they're already doing everything that they can. And maybe that our policy of just constant carrots and turning a blind eye to these horrendous events is empowering them to do that more. And it needs to be that the U.S., again, takes a much stronger stance on these things.
So Damian raised an interesting question. So why did Libya get this special treatment of the U.S. actually doing something?
I mean, it didn't. It was basically Nicolas Sarkozy who, sort of jumped up and down and said, I want to go and protect the people of Libya, really topple Gaddafi. And the U.S. said, okay, so, we'll sign the Security Council resolution, Medvedev promised to abstain, and we'll give you some air support and the rest of it. But the U.S., this is where the idea, the phrase lead from behind came from. We didn't raise this issue with the UN, France did. We offered some support, and it's true, within the first days, France ran out of bullets, or they ran out of missiles, I forget what it was, and the U.S. had to come in. But this was a case, I would submit, of probably too little intervention, not too much. And even Obama says the one mistake we made was we didn't actually stick around to ensure that this country didn't fall apart. And now it's a failed state. And now ISIS, of course, has taken over an enclave in the north. But, also the exception proves the rule. Obama campaigned on, and this is where the Samantha Power argument, he was going to stop genocide. He created an atrocities board, which is meant to essentially forestall or prevent another Rwanda. And he's now presiding over several Rwandas. One huge one in Syria, which is now bleeding into Iraq, and vice versa, and not doing anything really substantive about it. Look, ISIS they're as evil as you know, and even more so. But they're not the only problem. And I would argue that right now the cure is almost as bad as the disease. What is the U.S. response to this? And by the way, this was all foreseen and predicted. The Syrian people, there was a military defector in 2012. I remember this phrase. It's burnt into my cortex, so I'll never leave. He said, "You can give us a no-fly zone today, or you can have drones tomorrow." And that's exactly what has come to pass. And all this stuff, this is another example I wanted to introduce earlier. We can't give weapons to the rebels because, there's no moderates on the ground. When you give them anything, it all gets stolen by Al-Qaeda or by ISIS. This is a purposefully created self-fulfilling prophecy. What happens is, we give a handful of TOW anti-tank missiles to a handful of guys, but we tell them, we're not going to give you any ammunition, we're not going to, keep the missile launchers loaded for you. Here's like 12, go out. So they blow up 12 tanks, and they say, give us more. Like, no, we're not ready to give you any more than that. And so for about a year, or maybe 8 months, the groups that received this stuff, not a single one went missing, not a single one was stolen, whatever. But what did the US do? They didn't supply more on the basis of success. And then they decided to bomb everyone but Assad, and left these guys essentially with a giant bullseye on their back, because now you had Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the regime, backed by Hezbollah, the National Defense Force, and the Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, all gunning for the Western hirelings, or the CIA rebel brigades with their TOW anti-tank missiles. And so what happened? They got defeated, the weapons got stolen or confiscated by Al-Qaeda, and suddenly, this is what happens when you send arms to the rebels. Again, too little intervention, not too much. But hey, it's great PR, right? Because now the administration can say, see, this is why we don't get involved. This is why these hawks and these warmongers are wrong. No, it's not either or. There's a huge gulf in between. And you just have to be a little more creative and a little more committed. And don't treat this kind of crisis as an inconvenience or a distraction to what your real main goal is, your legacy, which will be, on the domestic front, it's Obamacare. On the foreign front, it is Nixon in China, except with Obama in Tehran. That's the goal. And everything else is just an inconvenience and a distraction. No. These things take center stage. What I'm always impressed with, George Bush was a disastrous president in so many ways, but at least he and his foreign policy team in turn 2 learned from some of their mistakes and began to readjust. Cutting deals and, this was Condi Rice's sort of outreach, with our European allies and so on. I have never seen an administration that the sky could fall, everything could burn down, and they have this sort of single-minded, monomaniacal focus. What we say we want, we continue to want. It doesn't matter. The rest is just noise. This is going to cause a big, big problem for us. I was covering Syria 4 years. I was in the Turkish refugee camps. I was in Aleppo, in a town, the town I stayed in, Al-Bab, is about an hour's drive north of Aleppo. The safe house I was in, all this belongs to ISIS now. When I was there, they said, Obama, he doesn't support Syria and the revolution because Israel. And I said, no, but okay. He said, then the conspiracy theory was, Obama, he just wants this nuclear deal with Iran, he doesn't want to upset the apple cart. Now, what you hear is, Obama hates the Sunnis and he prefers the Shia. Like the trigger has been pulled and something really bad has left the barrel of that gun. And it's only a matter of time before it comes back to the United States. This is why when people say, just forget about the Middle East, we're not interested in it. You might not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in you. And that's why the United States cannot absent itself or pivot away to China or the moon or whatever it is. Truly, truly, truly. And this is a crisis that we are very, very much complicit in because we were told these things will happen. And what Mouaz has done and the disclosures by Caesar, let me say, the State Department has said it, let me reiterate, this is a Holocaust. This is a Holocaust. It reminds me of what the Nazis were doing. If you look at the photographs, I know it sounds hyperbolic and everything is a reductio ad Hitlerum, but in this case it's true. Stories, women who were taken into Assad prisons in the early days and they had rats shoved into their vaginas as a form of torture. Anything you can think of, this regime has done, and then some. Okay, so this is not something that goes away or that is resolved or negotiated into oblivion by the UN Security Council. This is going to require some kind of military effort. And it may not be now, it may not be in 2 years, but it's going to happen eventually. And when it does, that might actually be a huge catastrophe because we've done it too late.
I worked on Libya before, and the veto wasn't there. Samantha Power did a lot to help in push for that intervention, but like he said, the French planes, I know this from good sources, were already on their way to Syria. It was a call to the White House saying, you got 20 minutes to call this off or not. And so we just followed the lead and led from behind. And again, we didn't follow up in the right way in Libya as where it is now. And when it comes to Syria, since the beginning of our intervention against ISIS, which I think was also a political reaction, he was much less, he called them the JV team early on, ISIS has doubled in size inside of Syria. And the barrel bombs that fall from the regime fall on the front lines where the Syrian rebels are fighting against ISIS. In the north, we're just fighting against ISIS, except just getting bombed by the regime. And that's resulted in the expansion of ISIS. While they're saying, by the way, that they cannot they can't trust to give the right weapons to the right people, and when they did give weapons, we had 90% accuracy. The Syrian rebels alone in Idlib province, without even any support from the US, got rid of ISIS in 6 days in Idlib province. In Aleppo, where they were way more entrenched, 27 days, the Syrian rebels got rid of ISIS. That's the biggest counterterrorism operation in the Middle East in modern history. We didn't hear a single word of appreciation or increased support for that. And ISIS, who took over, due to the failure of our policy in Iraq, took over the weapons that we gave to the Iranians, essentially, as we gave them Iraq itself, came back with advanced weapons from American weapons from Mosul and advanced inside Syria. So we've got ISIS with American weapons, the regime with Russian weapons, and we're still debating whether we should arm the people that espouse democracy and that want to have freedom.
Speaking of, so of course, let's go back to arming Ukraine. So I'm just going to ask the sort of devil's advocate questions, the talking points you're hearing from pundits inside the Beltway about why not to arm Ukraine. And so if you can we'll go down the line, just give me like a 2-sentence answer to this question. Arming Ukraine will explode the war, make it even bigger, and Putin could get to Kiev.
You mean giving the reasons why they say that?
Yeah.
Or,
But do you agree with that?
no, I mean, if Putin wants to roll into Kiev, I was in Kiev and I said, what happens if he does it? They said, then Ukraine will resort to partisan war and Russia will lose its regime in about 6 months. Because that's how many body bags will be sent back. I mean, don't underestimate the Ukrainian people's resolve. The idea that the goal behind this was erase the idea of the Ukrainian cultural national identity. If anything, Putin has revivified it and solidified it forever. And almost ended, I think, Russian hegemony in its classical sense. Is he stupid enough to think he's going to march, take Kiev? No, I don't think he would. And this is why, if we send javelin anti-tank missiles, he's going to use tactical nukes on Warsaw. Right, I mean, this is ridiculous. And by the way, that argument means that he is so much of a psychopath that the US should embark upon a policy of regime change or containment tomorrow. If you think Putin is going to nuke Europe, then we have a major geopolitical crisis on our hands. So this is all these chivalrous and these kind of hysterical, speculative counter-reactions. I think fundamentally, if he saw the cost that was being enacted, he would actually change his calculation.
He simply doesn't care, I'll make it short. That's it. I mean, the president simply does not care enough to do this, and for him, it's all a big headache, and he would rather just kick the ball down the road for whatever the next administration is, and leave with whatever achievements can, glorify his legacy. That's why it's important to hit him on that, because we are living through multiple Rwandans for this administration.
So for the sake of time, I'll just ask another. So Margaret Warner of PBS NewsHour actually floated this one, which I was shocked by. That someone of her caliber would say this. So one of the reasons not to arm Ukraine, according to the administration, is that the military leaders are incompetent. Could you comment on that?
I wouldn't say they're incompetent, but there's certainly lack of modern strategy, perhaps, and there is corruption within the Ukrainian military. The battalions themselves seem to be better organized, better supported, and if you were going to enlist, that would be a better place to go because they just function better. There's less of that corruption in this kind of bureaucracy of what was the post-Soviet Ukrainian army. So that is an issue that, as Alexander mentioned, that there are some instances of investigations and things like that. But I don't see major efforts being made to try to replace those people with new people whose loyalty is known. they say there's a lot of Saratnik, there's traitors. Russian sympathizers are still really embedded within that system, that they've never left, and it's hard to identify who they are, but that they do share intelligence and make decisions that cost Ukraine significantly. But I would agree with Alexander in the sense that exacting higher costs on Putin would change his calculation, that he does see that the West is not doing anything, and that is emboldening him. I mean, it's a pretty easy, I think, equation that he's looking at, and if there was more resistance and support, I think he would have to change his calculation. I don't think he has this grand plan. He's just kind of pushing and step by step, trying to feed the fire and see what he can get away with. But yeah, that's.
And here's a favorite of so this is the last question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for a couple questions. We have some foreign policy experts in the audience tonight. So a favorite of the administration for why not to arm Ukraine is the weapons will end up in the wrong hands.
Well, I think.
Alexander's pretty confident.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way to monitor where the weapons go and who gets them, and I think there must be a way to send international American monitors that they're not just going somewhere you don't know who's getting them and where they're going after that, but they can be tracked and there's some sort of trail. I think that would be, there's ways to kind of make that whole process more transparent and verifiable.
Sorry, this is a big one.
I mean, what hasn't Russia sent into Ukraine from its own arsenal? Books, Leopard artillery guidance systems, the most sophisticated material that it has. Actually, the only thing it hasn't done is sent in nukes.
Right.
And they might do that too.
Yeah.
There's talk about stationing, Iskander missiles in Crimea. So, I've heard the argument, it takes 2 weeks to train Ukrainian soldiers on how to use Javelin anti-tank missiles. The problem is I heard that argument about 4 weeks ago, so you could have trained them twice over by now if you had actually sent them. What happens if the separatists or the Russians capture javelins on the field? That means they're going to kind of, see what the American, so what? Then we'll just build new anti-tank missiles that they haven't got. And by the way, just because you captured on the field, it's a trick to get it all the way back to Russia without it being destroyed or damaged. I mean, look, you can come up with any excuses in the book. Every time somebody goes to war, every time somebody undertakes some kind of military endeavor, there's always risks. There's always unforeseen, the unknown unknowns, as a former defense secretary put it.
I just want to say that it's important not to get bogged down in these excuses, because that's all they are, they're excuses. And I think the counter question should be, okay, so you're telling me all the possible risks of this, and any option has risks. What are the risks of the inaction? The United States is not Denmark, it's the United States, so when it doesn't act, that's a conscious decision. And so what are the risks of letting things go the way they are, and see what they come back with that? Because I think everything else is a waste of time, and they're mere excuses.
Okay, a couple questions. Walter, do you have a...
Yeah, I actually have clarification on every time that Biden does make that phone call, if you don't see a Pentagon assessment team, this is what was told to us when we were with the parliamentarians 2 weeks ago in Washington. If you don't see those Pentagon assessment teams that are telling you what can and can't be shipped coming into Kyiv formally, then you know that they're not coming just quite yet. And so, in effect, we haven't seen that yet.
So it's just a press release,
So
essentially?
the press release is, yes, they're doing the non-lethal, and they're sending a lot more. They now promise that they're going to send a lot more non-lethal. But again, that issue is someone's playing when they're saying that they're thinking about lethal. If they were thinking about lethal, the Pentagon assessment teams are the ones that will also allow for export licensing. And that's very important because it's not just about the United States, it's about Canada, Poland, Lithuania. They have guns and ammunition that's coming from us. If the U.S. has not allowed for that, through the export licensing changes and so on and so forth, and through the Pentagon assessment teams, those countries can't move either. Canada, and it was told to one of our parliamentarians, in fact, the Vice Speaker, Kolodiy, he was told in Canada, we're ready to give you the guns the moment the Americans give you the guns. We've been there with you a long time. And so that's really the sad part. I agree, and I agree with the assessment. Michael, I read your stuff. I bury you with a lot of stuff on the emails these days, but and so do I with most of the people out there. So, but I was going to ask just one question of all four of you, because all of you have really had a sense of what's going on. On Obama, because it really does come down now to the president. His legacy, his greatest legacy, was to be the peacekeeper, and his greatest legacy as a peacekeeper would have been the non-proliferation. And yet, under his administration, the last 6 years, I mean, it's been an absolute disaster, starting with the Budapest memorandum and ending with those red lines in Syria, where weapons of mass destruction were used, and he didn't do anything about it. He let Putin dictate, and therefore Putin is now doing all sorts of wonderful things. Isn't that his enormous Achilles heel, even on the left, that here, this great peacemaker, this guy who's telling us that non-proliferation was his big legacy, that's, in fact, on Iran, he said. But it isn't really that, because even with Iran, that's when Netanyahu came here, because Netanyahu understood that, you know, the question is that Iran's got 10 years, and then after 10 years, Iran can do this. What kind of, I mean, the signals that are being given to the North Koreans, to the Iranians, to the Syrians with the lesser stuff, with chemicals, or the bio stuff that other people are developing. I mean, the fact is, that is the ultimate disaster. Even Georgie W., for all it's worth, and so that couldn't possibly have a legacy like that about in terms of non-proliferation. I mean, all the treaties have been broken, but the Russians just walked out of conventional forces treaties.
Sorry, Walter, we have to.
Sorry, no, I was not yet.
Finish up.
No, that was my question.
What was his question?
I heard it, no, you're right.
I think, I was finished.
Towards answer. In his naive foreign policy that's supposed to be non-proliferation, he's resulted, and as a peacemaker, it has resulted in multiple wars, multiple never-again moments that continue to this very day. So you're absolutely right in that assessment.
Yeah, I'm really sorry, that was the end of that question.
You know, it's a game of mathematics. So Obama campaigned on getting us out of 2 wars, and he's now gotten us into 3 more in the Middle East. If you count Syria and Iraq as 2 different wars, which I do, plus Libya. So there's your answer. And one other thing, though. I'm sorry, I know you said 2 words. I was so amazed. You know, I'm not a fan of Benjamin Netanyahu, but when he came to D.C., the one newspaper I did not expect to endorse his speech was Al Arabiya, the Saudi state-owned newspaper. And he said, if you can make the Wahhabist kingdom see eye to eye with the revisionist Zionist, then maybe Obama actually is a peacemaker.
One more question.
No, I'm sorry.
No? Okay. Okay.
Oh, I'm just
Well,
sorry.
we're gonna, so these guys will linger while we get stuff kind of cleaned up here, so you can beeline for them after this and ask your questions. And Damian and I are gonna go, everyone's invited, we're gonna go get some, we all need a drink after this, let's be honest. So we're gonna go to Clement Lounge.
On 7th Street between 1st and 7th. 7th Street between 1st and 2nd.
77.
77, yeah, and grab some beers and just kind of dunk our heads in them. So come on up and ask some questions. If we could move everybody to the lobby for all the beelining, that would be, and Andrea.